So no machine will ever feel the consequences of the actions it takes and the decisions it makes. So the responsibility is still yours, right? And so the reason it's agentic is because it has to shape an outcome, right? Something that automates a work process is not an agent. Something that carries out a task is not an agent because it doesn't bear responsibility. You bear the responsibility. And today, it's common for folks to want to say, we need explainable AI. That is an absolute abomination that invites litigation.
Yeah.
Right. You'll want to go back to the courtroom every time it's explainable, because the way somebody explains it has a different interpretation and a different meaning for everybody else. Right. So this is where causal comes in. And so if you think about, what do I need to know? What do I need to do with it? When do I need to do it? And do I have permission to do it? Well, in that time between when do I need to do it and do I have permission to do it, what happens is that in that time between the decision and the action, the value is leaking out the company. You don't have to accumulate all these data models forever, right? And build ontology around them, for which most of that ontology is manual mapping, right? Because the mapping is done through causality. That's the difference between what we're actually doing today and what we need to do. Because what happens with a data model is you actually become a news organization. And a news organization is one that says, this is what the world of tomorrow would be if it was like the world of yesterday. What you have is a knowledge graph that becomes a causal graph, right, for which you can extract a chain of reasoning relative to what you're trying to apply. And that chain of reasoning allows you to use the bottom layer, which is a structural causal model. And that structural causal model is the association layer that says, what evidence do I observe that makes a hypothesis I built true or not true? That's causality.
Welcome to the AI in Manufacturing podcast here on Industry Forward TV. My name is Kudzai Manditereza. I'm your host. And in this episode today, we'll try and unpack why agentic AI represents a structural transformation opportunity for manufacturing. And my guest on this episode to help us unpack this is Carroll, who is a global executive in industrial innovation and AI, and currently serves as the strategic advisor and fellow COO Council at LNS Research, and is also the chief strategy officer at TrekAI. I hope all of these titles are up to date with your LinkedIn, Mike. I didn't get any of those wrong. Absolutely.
There's a few others not listed, but that's okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you a chance in a moment to really sort of like give us a bit of a background about yourself and all these companies and efforts that you are involved in. But Mike is a really a very prolific and exceptional writer on LinkedIn, and this is kind of like really how I discovered most of his work. So you'll hear me reference some of his writing a lot throughout our discussions here. So Mike, it's such an honor to have you on this show today. Welcome.
I appreciate the welcome, and I appreciate the kind words. And it's gonna be a fun time. Most of these things, the way I look at them, are not me coming to try and tell what I know. These are all conversations of discovery, and every time I have these conversations, I probably learn more than I deliver. And the reason that's true is because and if you notice in all of our online discussions that we have, right, we have a whole community of folks that collaborates to generate the stuff that I write about. And we'll always say, we're not trying to be right. We're trying to get this right, because we're experiencing a time that in humanity that's never been experienced before. And so for any of us to think that we know it is a bit of hubris, right? And so what we're trying to do is ask collaboratively and collectively better questions so that we can go get this right. Now, we make assumptions about what we think will be true. That doesn't make it true. And so that's kind of the mentality we're trying to have. It's difficult to stay with that mentality because you want to take one side and you want to push a side as far as you can, and then somebody takes the opposite side and they push that side, and that's the way discovery works, right? It's through the debate of it, but always remembering that we're not trying to be right.
Absolutely. And kind of like that, one of the reasons why I started, this specific platform. So before that, I was really focused more on industrial IoT, connectivity, and things like that. But when that sort of like GPT moment happened, this is where kind of like a more pivoted the podcast to focus solely on AI and AI agents and things like that. Because for me, I realized that there's a huge shift that is imminent here, and it wasn't it's not very clear for a lot of particularly manufacturing leaders who are really head down, concerned about solving problems of the day. So I wanted to create a platform where we could kind of like, talk about these topics so they can sort of start to understand what's coming, what can they do now, and also weigh in sort of like their own perspective on what's possible and what's not, based on the current landscape. So, but before we dive into this topic, I would like you to sort of like introduce yourself to our audience, kind of like give us a bit of a background about yourself and all of the different companies and sort of like efforts that you're involved in.
So a little bit about myself. I grew up on a farm in rural Ohio, right? And the place I grew up is called Knock'em Stiff, Ohio, right? And so you can look it up. Just do a Google search, and you'll find it. It's a real place, and its name was adopted, right? Not as originally called Shady Glen, and then in the early 1900s, a circuit preacher named it Knock'em Stiff because of an event that he witnessed, and it became locally known as Knock'em Stiff. And I grew up there on a farm, and so having learned those lessons from my relatives, my grandfathers and my grandmothers and stuff, you learn the value of hard work, and you learn to be a generalist on the farms during that time. You don't learn to be good at any one thing, because in order to be successful, you had to be good at chickens, you had to be good at beef, you had to be good at crops, you had to be good at pigs, you had to be good at everything in order to survive, because in any one year, one thing may be good, another thing may be bad. So you learn to practice how to orchestrate all of this stuff, and that has served me well. And from there, I went to college with this insatiable curiosity, and was able to retire through some fortune, not wit, not smarts, not anything else, just fortune. I was able to retire for the first time before I was 50. And that was, like most decisions in my life, unwise. It was unwise because I still had lots of curiosity. And so I went back to work at GP. And a lifelong friend was executive at GP, and so I went to work there, and I was there for about 15 years. And then at the end of 24, I retired from Georgia Pacific, and we went through a lot of transformation at Georgia Pacific. And in that transformation, we went from a company that was largely traditional in the way that you would say forest products or pulp and paper companies were, to one of the foremost digital companies on the planet. And we did that the hard way, not the easy way.
Yeah.
We transformed how we thought about ourselves, how we got things done, and therefore how we went and done things. And it's not over. They're still doing it. And so you're always in this constant reinvention of yourself. And we learned a lot of things. And I'll tell you some stories about what success really looks like. It doesn't look like what you think it looks like. It looks like something else. So when we get to that point, you can ask me, and I'll tell you how to measure success, because it's not so apparent.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, really excited to dig more into this. Yeah, so I mean, just a couple of weeks back, one of guests on this podcast actually shared an interesting statistic with me from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, which said that the total productivity in manufacturing from the years 2008 to 2023 has been flat, and it actually declined at some points. And well, I'm not sure if you sort of like agree with the assertion of that statistics, but that was quite staggering for me, right? Because this is during a period where we've seen manufacturers deploying all kinds of digital tools, MES systems, ERPs, and SaaS applications. And I thought that would be a good point for us to start our conversation here, by getting your take on what you believe is structurally broken here for this to be the case. In other words, where did the promise of digitalization go wrong, or where is it going wrong?
So you're exactly right. So if you look at the St. Louis Fred chart, right? The St. Louis Fred chart is really clear that that's true. And so we started looking at it at GP, and then a guy by the name of Paul Boris really started holding people's heads, and we'll say it in knock 'em stiff terms, heads underwater on LinkedIn, saying, anybody paying attention? Anybody paying attention? Does this alarm anybody? And so when we started looking at it, what we saw was it really started to tip over in about 08, but in 2010 it really flattened out, right? And it actually declined. And the key piece of data we looked at was that when you look at attrition rate of individuals coming into and out of an employment system, it was running at about 16.5%. In 2010, what happened was that curve, which was really pretty flat, started to climb in 2010. So the first thing we did, being a news organization, right, just looking at data, the first thing we said was, aha, more people coming out of the system are coming in, and because we're losing talent and knowledge with them, our knowledge preservation networks and our training is insufficient, and that was the cause of it. That the technology we were applying, the MESs, the ERPs, wasn't sufficient to overcome the loss of knowledge. Now that may have been true, and so what you've seen was these people, they came out at a rate from 16.5% all the way up to 25% on a year-over-year basis, and so that was true all the way up to COVID. And then what we saw during COVID was that when COVID hit, productivity, more people came out, but productivity didn't decline, it went up.
Oh, wow.
So if that hypothesis had been true, you would expected productivity to continue to decline, but you saw this temporary spike in productivity. So pretty much had to throw that hypothesis out the door. So you get on the phone with Paul, who's this incredibly bright individual, and you say, all right, what we've been talking about doesn't hold. It may be true, but it's largely incomplete. And so we asked some questions. What did we do? Well, the very first thing we did was we turned off all the badges to the plants. Right? All the corporate people stopped going. They stopped calling. We got really, really focused about what we were doing. And then it went back to some lessons we had learned through some relationships with other companies. One of them, a large company called General Mills, right? And over time, what had happened was that there was a decline in cereal nationwide cereal consumption. Apparently, my kids don't eat cereal the way I did as a kid, right? And so that had caused cereal consumption went down. So plants had to be rationalized, and as we had learned in cooperation with them in these learning events, was that when you went to a plant and you told the plant that you're going to have to close the plant, they would tell the plant manager, hey, your prime objective is to keep the plant running and manage unplanned downtime. Well, every plant that they did that to, they saw productivity go up 15 to 20%. And so it was a focus event. And so we took that learning and we said, all right, what do we do? And we done the very same thing. We got very focused about what we were going to do. We managed disruptions or distractions, right?
Mhm.
And productivity went up. And so that we've seen that nationwide. And then we began to realize that apparently what was happening was that as people were coming out with experience at a greater rate, what we were doing was we were distracting the people who were the most vulnerable to distraction or disruption, which is the people with less experience. We were distracting them to a degree that they were less productive, right? And that in itself helped us understand that what are we doing with technology? And so if you think about what happened with technology at the same time, we began to apply lots of cloud-based data analytics to deliver more and more insights to people on the front line, right? Matter of fact, they see 8 times more information across 50% more equipment than they ever have since 1975, right? But they have 50% less experience, right? In the things that they work, in the things that they're in charge of. And so because that's true, we've hit this cognitive tipping point on their ability to make sense of it. And because we've hit this cognitive tipping point, we think more insights equals better performance. What happened was that we don't hit better performance. People have too much stuff to do. The other thing that happened was we believed that if we transferred transactional work to the front line, because these things, the MES, the ERP, they need data, right? And if we transfer transactional work to the people that are actually trying to use their adaptive capacity to determine what can I make adjustments to relative to how I see things are coming, right? What can I do to keep the downstream thing running, right? Based on the experience I have, right? And that's called adaptive capacity. We've consumed that adaptive capacity with transactional work, which requires task switching. Now we're asking them to text and drive, right? And that's evidence in the safety data. At the same time, the safety data got worse, right? And so we've actually enabled this by the things that we decided to go do without understanding the consequences of it. And so now what you have to do is you have to have a different mindset. You have to say, what is it I need to know? What is it I need to do with it? When do I need to do it? And then the last thing is, do I have the permission to go do it? Because most companies are permission architectures today because of the way the fragmentation has been created because of compliance structure that's built around governance in companies because so many issues have happened. And that was a long explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like one of the item that you mentioned here about what, you actually need for intelligence, like what is it that I need to do, when do I need to do it, and things like that. This is, I believe, what, sort of like agentic AI brings, to the table, as far as, kind of like automating that decision, as it were. And I think, but I find that a lot of operational leaders find it hard to grasp exactly where agentic AI sort of like fits into the picture, or kind of like the true potential of agentic AI. So they sort of like mistake it as another, digital tool they need to fit into their stack somewhere, just like an MES or an ERP system. And you've actually written that agentic AI is not a faster version of SaaS, but a different species of software, one that treats decisions, not transactions, as the atomic unit of work. And I find that really, insightful. Can you sort of like explain to us what that means, or what agentic AI actually means for manufacturing operations, and sort of like closing that productivity gap?
Yeah. So agentic is, so let's talk about it in human terms between you and I, right? Agentic really is tied to the concept that as a human, when you shape an outcome that you want in the future, you're creating agency for yourself, right? And that concept is that an agent is something that operates and bears your goodwill and your intention, and the responsibility is still yours even when it acts on your behalf, right? So no machine will ever feel the consequences of the actions it takes and the decisions it makes. So the responsibility is still yours, right? And so the reason it's agentic is because it has to shape an outcome, right? Something that automates a work process is not an agent. Something that carries out a task is not an agent because it doesn't bear responsibility. You bear the responsibility, right? And so when it shapes an outcome, it becomes an agent, even though you bear the responsibility. So as you think about an outcome, right? What an agent does and what you do is you think, what's true about the world around me relative to what I'm trying to shape for an outcome, right? And how do I understand that world? And then you say, okay, in that understanding of the things I want to go create an outcome in, right? What actions, what interventions can I take to create that outcome? So you create all these what ifs in that element of truth that you evaluate those actions against to say which one in time is the right action to take and orchestrated to shape that outcome, right? And then what you'll do is you'll say, I'm going to take that action, I'm going to evaluate the evidence, and I'm going to learn from it. That's creating agency for yourself. And so you would think about an enterprise in that way. That is called enterprise agency, right? An enterprise is trying to shape the outcome it wants relative to how it wants to measure it, right? Which is whatever the KPIs it wants, right? Relative to its intent and its purpose. So for us as individuals, what the agency world looks like is all the stuff that we do today. Most of our time is consumed trying to get all those things in place so that we can take an action, those decisions that we can take an action to get what we want for all the things that we think have to happen to get what we want. That's orchestration. There's an entire economy built around that for companies and for individuals. It's called the service economy, but we probably ought to call it the friction economy, right? Because there's a bunch of tools or apps on your phone, right, that are built to remove friction. What we're seeing today is that all of that stuff is being repriced to near zero, right? But there's a catch. The catch is that if you do this with speed through an LLM, right? We all know that an LLM, and we've all experienced it, can be wrong. Well, why can it be wrong, right? It can be wrong because of the principles of vector math. Now, they're getting better, but it's still the principles of vector math. They're only as good as yesterday's correlation, right, relative to the neighborhood of the words that they use and your ability to find the context that it does the math in. And so now what you're doing is you're always struggling with legitimacy, right? And if you think about all organizations, and we've all been in an alignment meeting, right? And so how many alignment meetings happen in organizations? Well, your calendar's full of them. If you look at your calendar, just go through your calendar and say, all right, how many of my meetings actually exist for alignment? And probably half of them or more, right? And so that would say legitimacy is one of the most expensive things that happens in a company. And so that legitimacy is built around the ability to say, where am I going to create the conversation that defines how I explain why we're making these decisions relative to who's responsible, so that we all can agree this is the explanation as to why we decided that's true. And you notice I use the word explanation. Mm-hmm. And today it's common for folks to want to say we need explainable AI. That is an absolute abomination that invites litigation.
Yeah.
Right. You'll want to go back to the courtroom every time it's explainable, because the way somebody explains it has a different interpretation and a different meaning for everybody else. Right. So this is where causal comes in. Right. So what causal does is, you remember I described that what's true and what do you do to make things true, and what evidence do you use to evaluate the hypothesis that your action actually was good or not, or that your counterfactual analysis was right. And so that is Pearl's ladder. So a guy by the name of Judea Pearl, I think it was 2009, won the Turing Prize for causality. And if you want to read a really difficult book, you should read his book, The Book of Why, written in 2018. And so what happens with causal is that causal is the math that says that I take the way I understand the world, I take the things that I do in the world, which is just another representation of the way you create agency. I build an understanding of how I do those things, and then how I observe the result of those things and learn from them, right? And create a causal understanding, right? For which I go forth and I learn from that. And then what I do is I create a chain of reasoning. The chain of reasoning is the exact legitimate description of why that is true. It's not an explanation. It is the reason as to why a decision was made. And now that you have the chain of reasoning, now it fits within, because a company is a governance engine, right? Now you have legitimacy that allows you to have permission that is defensible. And so that's what companies want. Companies want things that are defensible, right? So if I need permission, I need something that is defensible as to why that decision was made and I took that action. Something that's explainable is not defensible because it's always litigatable. That's why we have alignment meetings, right? You can explain it, and an alignment meeting is all about who has the best explanation, not who has the best chain of reasoning. Because when the numbers, in the way you know you have a company that can't trust its numbers, is you have an alignment meeting. And an alignment meeting means the politics matter more than the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to kind of like make it a bit more tangible, like what does that actually mean, like for people working on the shop floor? Like you spoke about this idea that pretty much most of the stuff that people do on the shop floor trying to make sense is going to system A, pull this piece of information, go to system B, pull this information, and then try to come up with sort of like an answer of what could be going wrong there. So what changes now with stuff like this agentic causal based agentic reasoning? What changes for the operator? What changes for the supervisor or the leader?
What changes is you no longer have to wait, right? And so you're in charge of, and you're responsible, which means that you're also the auditor of the chain of reasoning, right? And so you're the feedback mechanism because you're the responsible person. And so if you think about, what do I need to know? What do I need to do with it? When do I need to do it? And do I have permission to do it? Well, in that time between when do I need to do it and do I have permission to do it, what happens is that in that time between the decision and the action, the value is leaking out the company, right? And in that staircase, right, of permission because of fragmentation, that's where most companies lose a tremendous amount of value. And because decision velocity is stalled in that staircase or that ladder of permission. And so now what happens, the permission comes along with it because of causality. So now the when, you know when to do it, and the permission is with it. And so now when you see that, you also see the chain of reasoning, and you can challenge it, you can change it, right? You can audit it, and it actually comes with a governance standard that you, within those guardrails that are already preset, that you can go act. So you have greater confidence as to why, when, and where relative to what you're trying to achieve as an outcome, right? And so the fidelity is much, much higher relative to what you need to achieve, and it's immediate. And that's the interesting thing. And so if you think about what enables that, so there's this mass change that's happening. And so you would see that the world is largely becoming this world of this description of what's true about companies, What do they do that make things true? And then this durable core of what you would say, this architecture of software that defines how to use what's true about you and what you do to make things true, to write disposable context applications at the edge that you're a component of, that when the context changes, that the applications get rewritten and replaced, right? That you're always a part of the feedback mechanism as a frontline operator, right? As a frontline supervisor, and frontline also means the executives, right? So the durable core is at the center. So the executives are a part of this surface, right? Is always exercising control relative to the durable core. That is the definition of the operating mechanism relative to what's true about you, what you do to make things true. That's what the world's becoming.
Yeah. And what sort of like does it take as far as laying the infrastructure is concerned for that to happen? Because when I'm listening to you, talk about all of this needing to happen at the edge with immediacy, it kind of like uh, goes against what a whole lot of manufacturing companies are doing. Basically, what they're doing is they're creating this single source of truth in the cloud, right? With the data lake, the data warehouse, where they are just collecting data from all over the the enterprise and chucking it into a central data platform for the data scientists to come and try to make sense of the data. And in many cases, the data scientists don't even have that kind of like domain knowledge to make sense. So sometimes a decision would take even the whole day or even weeks just trying to make sense of the data. So what needs to change as far as the architecture is concerned and the data infrastructure is concerned for that to realize this idea of causal edge-based reasoning?
So you have to go away from a fixed architecture to an adaptive architecture, right? And the causal reasoning is really about trust and permission. So one of the ways to kind of break this down is to say, and so let's say, what do I believe to be true, right? And the first thing you would say is, do I believe that it's going to be true that connectivity is going to be ubiquitous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is, it almost already is, right? It's not quite as robust as I would like it. I carry my cell phone around and I can already see it's not quite as robust, but it's close, right? And so where I need it to be in the future, let's say it's going to be ubiquitous. That connectivity is going to be ubiquitous. The next thing that I'm pretty confident is going to be true, and it's getting there, is that reasoning is going to happen at the edge, right? And so for reasoning to be high fidelity reasoning, the kind that we can trust, it's going to have some element of causal in it where it needs to be, right? Because it has to be high fidelity. And now where it doesn't have to be high fidelity, and where it needs to, and where it's really close in temporal effect or time to you, what you'd say is that you can get away with just maybe an LLM based type reasoning, but for real high fidelity, high risk, you're going to have to be causal. The next thing is, in between those two, what you have is this architecture of permission and trust that says the reasoning at the edge has the trust and permission to engage and get and operate through the connectivity to get done everything it needs to get done. That architecture, that control mechanism, that's where all the authority is. That's where all the legitimacy is. And so that determines how effective your company is. That determines how well you participate in society as an individual, right? So your ability to participate in society, if you're operating or running agents that facilitate your ability to get things done as an individual, whether it's a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment or an email, or it's by a car, all the things that we want to achieve as an outcome for us, that now the friction economy we have to do for ourselves, it optimizes and does on our own just at our request. Those are all done by agents. That permission and trust architecture, how well that's done by agents, is going to be determined by how much trust and permission is enabled through that architecture by whoever owns that architecture. That's the greatest risk we face, both inside our enterprises and inside our lives, because that determines how well we get to participate or not. Because what's actually happening is it's not a speed thing. It's a collapse of time and distance, right? And that collapse of time and distance, it means that we are 1 degree separated from everybody and everything else on the planet, right? And that's a perceptual separation because of the effect that technology has.
Yeah, and I think that sort of like a collapse of the time and distance that you talk about. It's also some of the stuff that you reflected on on your writings, where you sort of like spoke about this idea that traditionally we've had this middle layer, right, where you've got people whose job really is to coordinate things like this, what you call the middle, which is going away. So if sort of like if I'm a COO right now listening and accept that framing, what does the new operating model look like? If I'm kind of like, if I'm to get rid of that middle layer where you've got
So
collapsing that coordination layer, as it were.
And because I spend a lot of time around COOs, the first thing I would do is stop thinking about technology. And I would start thinking about, what do I look like when everybody in the company is connected to everything and everybody else? What does that architecture in a company need to look like, right? And when I say architecture, I mean organization, right? Because remember, structure makes you effective. You got to go be effective before you can ever be efficient. And the reason that's true is because about 20% of 20% of what of value, right, is created by doing the right things. About 20% of value is created by doing those things right. It turns out about 60% of value is created by staying focused on them. And so in organizations that are fragmented the way we are today, right, because of the way the organization had to build itself around what it thought governance was, which really turned out to be compliance, and compliance was put into place to establish control, because what technology enabled the organization to move faster than the structure the organization was really enabled for, right? And that organization was an organizational structure. And so now what you have is you have this huge mismatch in enablement versus what the organizational structure is built around. So therefore you have alignment meetings while the value leaks out. And so now you have to go rethink that. And what you need to rethink is, why do I have to have all these folks to make decisions that are all adjacent, when in fact the folks that are responsible aren't largely the folks in the meeting? They just have opinions, right? And so now we're creating a narrative that everybody can support, and during that time the value is leaking out of the company, which makes me uncompetitive. There's a study done by a guy named, and everybody should look it up, because it was from an era in the past that kind of foretold the future. And it's done by a guy by the name of J. Robert Baum in 2003. He took 318 companies, and he looked across, and they're all different kinds of companies. He looked across them and said, is there anything that they're doing that makes them better or worse? And he found out that the highest performing companies from a value creation, margin creation, right, and growth, all those companies had a few things in common. The number one thing they had in common was they made decisions faster than their competitors. So decision speed and performance were proportional, right? The other thing that they did was they centralized strategy and decentralized operations, right? So they were able to get a kind of a holistic perspective about how to think what was true about them, right? And then let the operational components contextualize that at the edge. Yeah, and the other interesting thing was they only standardized the things that were not difficult, right? The things that were difficult for them to do, they didn't standardize the uncommon things, and so they didn't over-index on it. And he said largely those three things made up the companies that outperformed everybody else. They had a great deal of discipline, which allowed them to stay focused. And it's a really good study. If anybody gets a chance, it's pretty technical, but it kind of says in 2003, even this was true, that decision speed makes you perform better. Notice I didn't say quality, right? Decision speed.
Decision speed. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is, part of the, alignment meetings that you mentioned is this assumptions, right, about how business is really is run. And one of the striking ideas in sort of like your writing is this what you call assumption observability, right? Like sort of like treating the beliefs that underpin business decisions as first class entities that need to be tracked, tested, and governed, just like your sort of like inventory and things like that. So I mean, this is I believe most leaders never thought about their organization in this way. This is kind of like a shift, as it is. So can you explain what this actually looks like in practice and why it matters so much for manufacturing transformation?
I think because you basically operate through your organization, right? And your organization is the mechanism that you use to operate through. It's what makes you effective. That if you set up the organization in a way that makes it hierarchical and more fragmented, what happens is you instill these gates, right? And these gates become obstructive in a way that slows your company down, right? And so one of the easy ways to understand that is that let's look at the interaction between the operations organization and the IT organization, right? And so here we have the operations organization that is trying to go transform and become much more competitive, right? And so now what happens is the operational organization is given a technology platform to go do something, right? And so largely that technology platform is decided on, right? Sometimes by committee, but it is decided on by the interest of the IT organization relative to what their strategy is, right? And so now the operational organization has to go make use of that, right? And so that's a paradigm, which means that every time the operations organization wants to go do something, he has to go to the IT organization and say, can I have permission to go do that? And the IT organization says, can I have permission to go add capability and capacity to enable you to give you permission to go do that so you can get done what you need to get done. So you have this vicious cycle of permission between two individuals of capability, right? And so it's gated. And during that whole time, what's happening, right? The opportunity value is leaking out the company. And so a better paradigm, right, is a structure that kind of looks like this. What does the operations organization need to achieve? The IT organization needs to enable that, right? It's not permission. It's saying, okay, here's our strategy. Here's what we're trying to create competitive advantage. You need to deliver technologies that allow us to enable competitive advantage. You need to enable that. We'll configure it, right? But you need to deliver the technology that allows us to create competitive advantage in this way. And that gets rid of the delay, because it's always within this governance guardrail that says, this is our strategy, this is what we're trying to do, this is enablement, and you need to deliver the technologies that enable us to go do that. We don't know what they are, but that's your job, right?
And do you believe that addresses this imbalance? Because a lot, when I speak to OT IT teams, in many cases there's that tension where the operations team, they want to be able to move as quickly, have that agility to be able to address problems as and when they arise. At the same time, the IT wants to be able to govern, so that avoid all this shadow AI or shadow IT things going on. How should organization think about striking that balance, or do you believe everything should be edge, sort of like bottom up?
I think you need to be adaptable. If you have shadow IT and you have shadow AI, that's a signal you shouldn't ignore. It exists for a reason, right? It exists because you're not enabling the organization to be as competitive as it needs to be to fulfill the context that it's experiencing at the edge, because there is some mechanism in the way that the IT organization is preventing that from happening. Now, there may be reasons from a security and or a governance perspective that makes some of that true, but it's a signal you shouldn't ignore. And so, from an operations perspective, what you should always ask is we have a strategy for which we adopt and we're competitive relative to context at the edge, and are we managing that governance ourselves, right? And so security is one of those really good conversations to have, right? Who are the best people in the company to manage security, and who are the best people from a governance perspective as far as standards and practices and protocols, and who are the best people in the company to actually manage it on site, right? And oftentimes you'll find companies have a matrix type organization when it comes to responsibility for security, and those are always more vulnerable than the ones that aren't that way. And so if you have from a security protocol and governance perspective, if you have a real clear expectations of who's responsible for security, right, and who's responsible for managing the governance at the operations organization, and what the accountability is for maintaining those standards inside the facilities, and that governance, and where it begins and ends with the plant managers, and that they can be affected by not properly managing those things, goes a long way, right? But you have to be intentional about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one example that I could think of kind of like such a tension, specifically in my world, is the data modeling aspect of it, where there's friction to say, do we sit down and try to build an ontology and model everything that exists within our entire enterprise, and or should we just enable the OT team to contextualize the data at the edge and not really try to conform to a strict standard, because then that slows us down. We just want to be able to contextualize the data and push it up, because then we know with advanced AI, we're able to make sense of the data without a strict data model. Do you have thoughts on, as far as data modeling is concerned, on how this should be approached?
I do. Here's the question I always ask. I ask all the COOs, and this is relative to what the future looks like. Imagine for a second that the y-axis is variables, and the x-axis is data, right? For the last X number of years, since the early 2000s, we've been putting in more devices, and we've been accumulating variables and data on this never-ending curve, and more information, more data products, more insights, and that's been accumulating over time. And the nationwide data says that performance has gotten worse, right? So probably more data models is not going to help. What are we going to do with them? And then the next thing I say is, if I come to you and the company comes to you and says, I'm going to give you stock options, do you turn them down? And no turns them down. Next question is, do you exercise them the very second or day you get them? And most of them say, no, only an idiot would do that, right? You take the options. And so what if of all those variables that you collected only the ones that mattered for some future decisions that you needed to make, right? Off in the future, and only the data relative to those variables that you needed to use as evidence to prove your hypothesis were right, that you built for those future decisions. And they say, well, I'd rather do that. And I said, exactly. You know what the subscription for that is? It's causality. Because causality tells you what variables matter and what variables don't matter, and what data relative to those variables matter for some decisions in the future that you're going to have to make decisions about. So what you're really doing is you're putting optionality into the future that allows you to make decisions that you need to make in the future. You don't have to accumulate all these data models forever, right? And build ontology around them, for which most of that ontology is manual mapping, right? Because the mapping is done through causality. That's the difference between what we're actually doing today and what we need to do. Because what happens with the data model is you actually become a news organization. In the new, in the news organization is one that says, this is what the world of tomorrow would be if it was like the world of yesterday. And I can predict tomorrow if tomorrow was like yesterday. But that's never true. Not in today's world where dynamism is so high. And so now you actually need a causal model, which is not a data model.
Yeah, and is a causal model tied to something like a knowledge graph? Because I've heard someone who mentioned that the solution for their company, what they're doing is they're actually building some distributed knowledge graph, as it were, or federated knowledge graphs that allows the OT to plug into the bigger knowledge graph, and then it grows as and when you sort of like build that context.
So it's a good question, right? And so a causal model, as Pearl defines it, right, is you take the things that you know are true about you. You can define this, and it's where LLMs come in. It's a description of what you know is true. Those things actually exist in all your employees' heads. They exist in your documentation about your company. All this stuff is and has been defined as to what is true about you, your intent, and then you take all the things that you do to make things true, right? So remember, Pearl's ladder is the top layer is kind of this imagining layer, or we call it a principal causal model, right? What are the principles about what I do, right? And then the next layer down is a rational causal model. Pearl calls it the do operator layer. What are the things I do to make things true relative to how I do counterfactuals in the imagining layer? What do I imagine would be true if I do these things, right? Relative to these principles, right? And so that is a causal model that you can extract through all the stuff you know. Then you build what's called a chain of thought that then becomes this chain of reasoning through the application of Pearl's math, right? Then once you apply that, what you see is this reasoning, right, graph, right? So it's chain is this. So you what you have is a knowledge graph that becomes a causal graph, right, for which you can extract a chain of reasoning relative to what you're trying to apply. And that chain of reasoning allows you to use the bottom layer, which is a structural causal model. And that structural causal model is the association layer that says, what evidence do I observe that makes a hypothesis I built true or not true? That's causality.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think we were, quickly running out of time, but I kind of like wanted to get your sense on, for specifically for COOs or VP of operations who are listening to this right now and thinking, I get it, right? This is what I need to do. This is how I need to start to think about things. But where do I actually begin, right? What would you tell them as sort of like in terms of the first structural commitments? what should they start doing now in preparation for this new world?
So here's the first step I would take. I'd look at the current architecture I have. I'd lay it. I'd lay it out. I'd lay out how I think I get things done, right, in my company. And then I would say, in these steps of the way I get things done in my company, where is the inferencing load really high? Where people have to bring in insight and information, and they have to think about what to go do with that information, right, in order to convert that information into a decision relative to interaction with other people. Where's that inferencing load really high? Multiple things to think through, right, both organizationally and individually, right? The next thing I want to do, right, and what you'll find is that you already know where it's at, right, because that transactional stuff is there's a lot of inferencing done, and because a lot of insights come together to create human inferencing, that's delay. The next thing you want to do is you want to take that same map and you want to start putting a different color to it. That where is the permission load really high, right, in that same model, and circle that. And then where you see permissions and inferencing line up, that's where all the value is leaking out of your company. You got to go fix your architecture that's causing the inferencing load and the permission load to be really high. The first thing you need to fix is why do I need so many permissions? And then you need to figure out, okay, what about what I'm doing with inferencing is causing these people to have to make so many inferences with the insights that I can just automate. Is that possible, right? Through the application of artificial intelligence, right? And if you can solve that, what you'll figure out is, okay, now I can use an architecture of an organization that's more aligned to outcome. And then you'll see the organizational structure probably needs to look a little different to facilitate that from a effectiveness perspective rather than a gate perspective. Because if somebody has to be involved in a decision that is not responsible, you need to start removing these folks. Not because they don't add value, just because they don't need to be a part of the permission decision.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I mean, before we close this session, Mike, thank you so much. But I would like to give you an opportunity to, talk to our audience about where they can find you, how they can engage you. We're going to provide some links to your LinkedIn, to your website. But if you've got some words that you'd like to share, with our audience about how they can engage you.
So I speak at a lot of places, and I write a lot of stuff which you've graciously talked about and read. And so I just want to invite everybody to join, right, the conversation. Remember, we are not trying to be right. Me and Paul and Grant and Peter, there's a whole bunch of us that share a bunch of information. We're trying to get this right. And so invite everybody to comment, everybody to write. And the reason I want folks to write is the best way to gather your thinking and expose that thinking, right, in a way that says, help us think this stuff through, right? We don't say this because we think it's right. We say it because we're inviting people to join the conversation. And so there's a guy named Stephen Johnson wrote a book called Where Good Ideas Come From. And in that, he talks about this surface perimeter, right, of that keeps growing, that says that it's the quarter power law of innovation. The more people that join and the more people that contribute, the greater the amount of innovation, and the sooner we'll get to better knowledge and a greater understanding of what it is we're trying to do. We have not lived in this world, so there's no way that we know what this world is going to be and what we're going to experience. Nobody knows what a user experience in the agentic world feels like. And so we're going from an experience where what was hard, right, getting all this stuff together and orchestrating it to get what we want, right? That's hard, but what we want, we spend very little time on, right? And we're going to have all this time to think about why it is we want what we want. So join us in that. You can find me on LinkedIn really easily. And if you want to talk, just send me a note. I'm happy to have a conversation. And I am very grateful to have been a part of this and happy to do it anytime. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm actually going to close this session with one of I just couldn't stop taking some quotes from your your article. There's just so much valuable insights. But I really like this one that you shared about in 1944, economist Frederick Hayek warned, in quotes, the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge. That is really for me quite an insightful, quotation, especially as I think about all of this and how to bring knowledge or how to make knowledge available for AI agents. So again, Mike, thank you so much for your time here. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience will find it valuable.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.